Most people believe financial crises are unpredictable, but the structure that creates them tends to repeat. Because the system does not collapse randomly, it tightens first. And once you recognize how that tightening works, the idea that 2008 was a one-time event begins to fall apart. What happened back then was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. And patterns, when left unchanged, tend to return. But this is not about predicting a crash. It is about understanding a mechanism that begins long before anything breaks. And one that most people only recognize after it has already moved past the point of visibility. The events of 2008 did not begin in 2008. They began years earlier, inside credit markets, inside lending standards, inside the quiet expansion of debt that seemed manageable. Until it wasn't. At the surface, everything looked stable. Housing prices were rising, credit was widely available. Banks appeared well capitalized, liquidity seemed abundant. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. Risk was being mispriced. Debt was being layered. And access to credit was expanding beyond what the system could realistically sustain. What made 2008 significant was not just the collapse. It was the sudden shift. Credit, which had been widely available, became restricted almost overnight. Liquidity, which had seemed endless, began to disappear. And institutions that appeared stable revealed how dependent they were on continuous access to funding. That shift did not happen randomly. It was triggered by a loss of confidence inside the system itself. Once institutions began to question the quality of the assets backing their counterparties, the entire structure began to tighten. Lending slowed. Interbank trust weakened. And the system, which relied on constant movement, began to stall. That is what a credit contraction looks like. Not a sudden crash, but a gradual tightening. A reduction in willingness to lend. An increase in scrutiny. A quiet shift from expansion to preservation. Today something similar is happening, not in the same form. Not in the same assets. But in the same structure. Consumer debt has reached levels that resemble previous peaks, notably in credit cards. Balances have expanded, interest rates on those balances have risen. And delinquencies, while not extreme, are beginning to move. Individually, these signals do not indicate collapse. But collectively, they describe a system under increasing pressure. At the same time, banks are adjusting. Lending standards are tightening. Approval rates are becoming more selective. Limits are being reduced. These changes are not announced loudly. They appear in data, in small shifts, in patterns that resemble something familiar. The system is not breaking, it is adjusting. But adjustment is how stress begins to show. One of the least visible aspects of this process is liquidity. Liquidity determines how easily money moves through the system. It is what allows banks to meet obligations, process transactions, and maintain confidence. When liquidity is abundant, the system feels smooth. When liquidity tightens, friction appears. That friction is often subtle. A loan takes longer to approve. A credit line is reduced. A transaction requires additional verification. Each event is minor. But together, they indicate a change in conditions. In 2008, liquidity did not disappear all at once. It receded, quietly. Until the system reached a point where confidence could no longer sustain it. The same structural dependency still exists. Modern financial systems rely on continuous access to credit. They rely on the assumption that funding will always be available. And when that assumption begins to weaken, the system adapts. This is where the parallel becomes important. Not because history repeats exactly, but because the underlying mechanics remain similar. Debt expands. Risk accumulates. Confidence sustains the system. And when confidence begins to shift, the system responds by tightening. Most people never see this process while it is happening, because it does not feel like a crisis. It feels like small changes, small inconveniences, small adjustments, until those adjustments reach a threshold. If you want to understand how these structural shifts develop before they become visible, consider subscribing, because most people only recognize them after the system has already changed. During periods of tightening, another dynamic begins to emerge. The difference between financial assets and tangible assets becomes more visible, not immediately, but over time. Financial assets depend on the system. They rely on counterparties, on liquidity, on functioning markets. Their value is not only determined by price, but by the ability to transact. Tangible assets exist outside that dependency. They do not rely on interbank lending. They do not depend on digital infrastructure. They are not processed through clearing systems. They exist independently of the financial network. This distinction becomes more relevant when the system is under stress, because stress affects the system first, not the assets outside of it. Precious metals have historically occupied a unique position in this dynamic. Not because they are immune to volatility, but because they exist outside the credit system. They are not someone else's liability. They do not require trust in an institution to exist. Gold is often associated with this role. But silver introduces an additional layer. It is both a monetary metal and an industrial one. Its demand is not only financial. It is also functional. This creates a different kind of pressure. Industrial demand can constrain supply, while financial demand can increase during periods of uncertainty. These forces can interact in ways that are not always predictable, but they tend to converge during periods of systemic stress. In previous cycles, metals did not immediately respond to crisis. In 2008, they initially declined alongside other assets. Liquidity stress affected everything. But as the system stabilized and monetary responses expanded, metals began to move. Not suddenly, but persistently. This movement was not driven by panic. It was driven by a shift in perception. A recognition that the system itself had vulnerabilities, and that assets outside that system carried a different kind of value. Today, the structure is more complex. Digital systems dominate, financial assets are more interconnected, and access to money is more dependent on institutional infrastructure than ever before. This increases efficiency, but it also increases dependency, and dependency introduces risk, not immediate risk, but structural risk. The idea that access to money is always available is based on normal conditions, but normal conditions are maintained. They are not guaranteed. When systems adjust, access can change. Not disappear, but change. Limits can appear. Delays can increase. Conditions can tighten. These changes rarely happen all at once. They emerge gradually, often unnoticed, until they become difficult to ignore. This is the nature of systemic shifts. They do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves through behavior. The comparison to 2008 is not about predicting the same outcome. It is about recognizing the same structure, a system built on credit, a system dependent on confidence, a system that adjusts when that confidence begins to weaken. And those adjustments are already happening, quietly. The interface still looks stable, balances still appear unchanged, transactions still go through. But beneath that surface, the system is recalibrating. It is evaluating risk. It is adjusting exposure. It is preparing for conditions that may not yet be visible. And that preparation often involves control, not visible control, but structural control. The kind that only becomes apparent when it is encountered directly. This is why moments of restriction feel unexpected, because they interrupt an assumption that the system will always behave the same way. But the system does not operate on assumptions. It operates on conditions, and those conditions are constantly changing. Over time, this creates a quiet realization. Being inside the system provides access, but it also requires compliance with rules that are not always visible, rules that can shift, rules that can tighten, rules that define how and when money can move. The longer the system remains stable, the less these rules are questioned, until they are encountered, not dramatically, but directly. Have you ever experienced a moment where something that should have worked financially suddenly didn't, without a clear explanation why?